So what we're going to do is really talk through all the details that you'll need in terms of whether the challenges of managing inventory that emerging brands end up going through, what are some of the opportunities for doing it better and eliminating some headaches, and some really great tools to be able to make all of that happen. And so in order to do that, I'd love to introduce my guest, Morgan, who's with Fiddle, to talk about this whole process. We're going to have a quick presentation as Morgan's just going to share through a couple of ideas with us, and then we're going to have a discussion. And then what we'll actually do is take questions throughout the presentation as well. So you'll be able to get any of your questions answered and hop on and ask some of those directly to Morgan. So Morgan, I will let you take it off from here.
All right, awesome. Well, nice to meet everybody. Thanks for having me, Jordan. And I'll go ahead and share my screen. Just let me know that that looks good and you all can see that.
Yep, looks good.
Okay, so like Jordan said, we're going to talk about tracking inventory and operations. And so, you know, the details are really the key to scale, right? So if you can track everything, inventory, orders, fees, costs, and collaborate with your partners, right? Collaborate with your co-packers, your 3PLs, your suppliers, then it's going to enable you to really scale. So why we're going through this, I'll try to keep it high level, and then we'll dig down deeper as we ask questions that are relative to the people on this webinar. So CPG Brands, right? You guys are creating products in niche categories. You are maybe in a really new up and coming category, or you're finding ways to create cleaner products that are healthier. And as you're doing that, you're finding your channels, right? Your channels to sell on. It might be just Shopify or an e-commerce platform, or it may just be an Amazon, right? But then you may go to marketplaces like a Thrive or a Fair, as well as landing in grocery stores and brick and mortars, right? So as you're doing this, you have partners that you're working with, your co-packers, if you're using co-packers and not producing it all in-house, your ingredient suppliers. And so in this, I guess, workshop, we're going to assume that most food and beverage are sourcing parts of their product, right? That might be bringing it in-house to make it themselves, or that might be sending it over to their co-packer to help make sure that the quality, the price points are where aligned, where you need to be to hit your margins. So these, the supply chain, we like to look at it from our point of view as a supply network, right? Without your co-pack, without your suppliers, without your packaging suppliers and your 3PLs, you couldn't really get the job done. So those are your partners in building and scaling your business. So really understanding all the fees and everything that goes with sales, all the fees and costs in production, dialing that in is going to help you determine when and how to scale your product. So let me just go on to this next one, right? And so ideally your team, you and your team, it may just be you, but know your inventory levels. And that's not just at your 3PL with your finished goods, but that's as well any items that you're sourcing and sending over to your co-packers. And then you just know lead times, right? You know, lead times on buying your labels, your packaging, your bottling, your boxes, and any ingredients to get to your co-packer, right? And so we like to kind of look at this chart, right? You have your production, everything that you need to do to get items, and you're working with your supplier and co-packers. You have all your inventory tracking from raw materials to lots to your finished goods. You have all your sales, right? Different channels. And I've kind of put a couple stars here that these are the things that we really want to get into a little bit today, that we see are maybe the pain points of trying to scale, right? Your product costing. One thing that we see very often is that when you send that PO to a supplier and you bring it in and you have it your co-packer, what other fees are coming into play? Are there shipping? Are there freight? Are there storage? Are there pallet fees? All that's going to come into play to hit your true margins, right? And so you need to make sure that you're tracking that. And then lot tracking. We want to just talk a little bit about traceability to make sure that you're compliant, so that when you're ready to scale and you're ready to land the grocery stores, the big box stores, the Costco's, that you can have that traceability to present the recall and compliance stocks so that you can get into those stores. And then sales. It's interesting that the sales, right? You bring it in if it's just through Shopify, you have all your sales, you can run sales reports, but as soon as you start adding channels, and as soon as an Amazon or a Fair or other marketplaces start taking portion of those sales to be on their platforms, you just got to make sure that you're calculating all the fees and shipping, pick, pack, and ship from your 3PL to make sure that you know your true profit and how much you're losing or the amount you're making when you go through these marketplaces. And then fulfillment, just knowing what stock on hand, right? Understanding that, hey, I sold 10 items per day for the last 30 days, and pretty average. So when I go into production, I need to make sure that I have this amount to be able to sell at that level, right? And so kind of triggering reorder points and understanding that consumption across all your different levels of inventory. And then we'll just pop into a little more of showing kind of the keys, right? I've touched on a lot of them, but you're tracking, I mean, most of you, I imagine, are really small teams and you're tracking all this yourself, right? And so you want to make sure that you see the numbers. Jordan in the past has shared some of the Google Docs and spreadsheets he's created, and they tracked almost all of this information. So he's able to see and have the data to know where to scale, which channels are the best, and kind of where to put more energy, right? And dialing this in is going to give you some security in knowing that, okay, now you can go focus on selling more, building your brand when you have all the operations and inventory systems in place. So really just to kind of touch on this again is knowing inventory at all levels, right? So if you send a bunch of inventory, sourcing, packaging to your copacker, are they updating you accurately? Are you getting updates? If not, are you able to track it yourself, kind of virtually? When they do a production run, can you deplete those items and see what you have left to know if you need to place orders for more packaging or ingredients? Understanding your true margins and when you sell stuff on different marketplaces, right? If you're selling on Thrive, they ask for almost 20% below wholesale many times. And so are you calculating all that, understanding your true sales and margins? Lead times. This can be a bit tricky, especially with everything that happened in COVID. And having those lead times and understanding how long it's going to take to get a label packaging made into your copacker. And then also having second and third and fourth options for all your suppliers, right? And I imagine Jordan can speak to this a little bit too, as several you can. If you just go with one supplier for that one ingredient or that one packaging, and they get backed up or they have something break down, it hurts you, right? So just having other second and third options to make sure you can source from. Accurate inventory from your partners, right? The 3PL should be updating you daily if you're selling online and selling in marketplaces that they're shipping out to, and making sure those updates are in real time. Also, just a landed cost. Again, I touched on that earlier. Let's make sure that as you bring in supplies, as you bring in ingredients, that you're adding your shipping and freight. Unfortunately, we met with the company about a week ago, and they were really doing really well. I think they did a couple of 100,000 in 3 or 4 months, and they were brand new, but they weren't going back in and tracking all their shipping from overseas and their freight, and it just crushed their margins, right? And they thought they were making a lot more and putting that money back in. And when they saw that there was 20, 30% that was being paid on shipping, it really hurt them, right? So just being able to go back into your POs and adding those costs. And then again, traceability. Like you want to set up your lot tracking, your batch tracking from the get-go, so that if you scale really fast and you find a distributor or big box store that wants to put you in their store, that you have those documents and that compliance. Yeah, and Jordan, that's kind of our quick little presentation. Love to get into more questions and provide feedback on what people are looking for.
Awesome. Definitely appreciate that, Morgan, and love this kind of keys to success in the chart here, because as we can attest, right, like managing your operations, you're managing your business. There's really two main sides of it. There's your operations, production, making the product, and the other side is sales, fulfillment, giving it to the customer. And that can be such a big challenge to keep both of those aspects in balance, right? So when you have sales coming in, do you have enough inventory and production capacity to fulfill it? And then if not, what do you do, especially if you're working with companies with long lead times?
Right.
I know you've been working on this inventory side for a long time, kind of helping companies manage their operations. I'm kind of curious to know, like, what did you learn over the past year or 2 years that brands really need help with tracking in this space? Besides these, like, is there anything that you realized, like, hey, we really had to help brands solve this problem so that they could better understand their data or their business?
Yeah, great question. So one of the things that we've noticed that is a shift in how there's so many CPG brands coming out, right? But because it's in niche categories and sustainability, kombucha, CBD, keto, people they really want to make sure the ingredients are pure and clean and the packaging is on point. So before, a lot of people just go to their contract manufacturer and just say, hey, here's what we want. Go ahead and source everything and make it for us. But now brands are taking it upon themselves to source all their ingredients to make sure they get the clean and the right ingredients, and then the packaging that might be recycled or sustainable, and send that directly to the copacker. And when you don't ever like have it on site or control it or touch it, it's a bit hard to track, right? And so we've seen that being a huge pain point, is just to know how much inventory I have at my copacker, and to know if my production run can hit the numbers I need to fulfill my orders coming up.
No, I think that's a huge point. It's interesting. You're mentioning earlier, previously at shared a Google sheet that walked through what I built for T Squares in order to manage our operations. And it was like a convoluted spreadsheet with about 20 different tabs managing all parts of our business, right? And it got to the point where it kind of just collapsed. And I think that's also a concern of people, is like, what tool do I need for which stage of my business, and when do I upgrade, and like, how do I go about doing that? Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, definitely. So what we've seen is, okay, if you're selling on one platform online, you can usually track that pretty good on that platform and have spreadsheets that support it, and it works out. And that is sustainable. As soon as you start adding multiple channels of sales, the complexity of knowing when to get items to your 3PL to be able to fulfill all those channels, spreadsheets start breaking down, right? If you're doing all the sourcing, like we've talked to probably a dozen different brands in the last week, that they are in charge of 100% of the sourcing of all the materials to send to the copacker, and the copacker's just doing the totaling, right? Just assembling it. And that is where spreadsheets are really hard, right? With COVID and with kind of lead times, you have to manage multiple suppliers for one ingredient. And that's where you need to automate that. You need to understand that and have it presented to you. So you can say, all right, if I buy this at this quantity and it's this lead time, I can store some extra at my copacker and actually save some money because I'm buying at a little higher quantity, right? And so when you add multiple channels, especially marketplaces or brick and mortars, those are key triggers. As well, if you need compliance docs, right? Spreadsheets, you don't have your batch records, your manufacturing records, or those lot tracking functionality.
No, I think I love that. Stephanie, I see your hand is raised. Did you have a question or you're waving hello?
I do. Sorry, and I was a little bit late, so I didn't know what the process was for this
Perfect. Nope,
particular question.
yeah, no, this works great. So
Okay.
just for anyone, if you have a question, you can use your hand raise function or type in the chat, and then you can hop on video and ask your question. So go ahead.
Awesome. I just have to say this is like music to my ears because we are exactly where you were saying, Morgan. We use QuickBooks. I source everything for our copacker, which we just started using in November. You know, we've been in business now for 7 years. So all of our numbers have been in spreadsheets and now QuickBooks. And I have been trying to figure out how to do all of this. And so my question is, considering that we are a 7-year-old business, we have used all these different methods of trying to stay on top of things. I now completely feel overwhelmed and out of control with all of this stuff. Where do we start? Obviously, I think part of the answer would be we start with using a service such as yours. But you know, from the standpoint of, you know, let's say we signed up to work with you, where would we start in all of this? Because, you know, like I'm in production right now, so I've got new inventory come in, but I have current inventory. Do you know what I mean? That's really what I'm having trouble wrapping my head around, like, because I'm not starting fresh. I'm not a new company.
Yeah, no, great question. And congratulations on the growth. In the 7 years. So my question first would be, how often are you doing production runs?
So that's, you know, we just started working with the copacker and we're trying to get, we're somewhere around monthly.
Okay. So where I would start is connecting to where you're bringing in your orders. Right? If it's on Shopify, if it's a marketplace, let's start bringing in those orders and tracking your SKUs, right? If it's at brick and mortars, you know, and it's boutiques and small mom and pop shops, then just bring those manual orders in. And then let's start seeing kind of your rate of what you're selling across each SKU, right? And then what you're going to start seeing is, okay, now I can kind of see what I need to run and start looking at the numbers that I need to run each month if I continue this growth. And then you build out your formulas and you start tracking your raw materials as well as POs. And in that way, when you're ready to go into production, you can just jump in and push some production runs, which we call work orders. And then you'll see everything you have on hand and be able to order what you need to make that order go through at your copacker. So, I mean, it is the supply chain, right? There's a lot going on. There's a lot of moving parts. It really is. We dial in on what is the biggest pain that you're feeling right now, right? Because once you do that production run, it's almost all about tracking orders and lining up the next production run. So it's just trying to get ahead of that.
Morgan, maybe this is to Stephanie's question as well, but right, when you have 7 years worth of data, is it important to bring all that data into your next software? Or do you just kind of have like a clean break where it's like before and after?
That is a great question. And I guess it really depends on the business, right? Because my question would then be, you went with a copacker in November, or does that mean you're now selling more and selling in more channels? Because if that's the case, then I definitely think you need to bring in orders to be able to track your new sales velocity, your new consumption, and so that so a software can start tracking that to determine production runs in 6 months from now.
Yeah,
right.
I think one thing. Oh, go ahead, Stephanie.
I was going to say that is part of the challenge that I have every month, because nothing sells the way that you think it's going to. It's my experience, you know. We have 8 flavors. We have 8 flavors, and just when I think I know which one's selling the best, the next month another different one takes the lead. You know what I mean? So it's like, how do I, you know, like I said, this conversation is kind of music to my ears. So.
And what I would say too, Stephanie, from my experience, because, you know, I've had to make that transition as well. And there's this like feeling that you need the legacy of the data and information, which to some degree is true, but you don't necessarily need it everywhere. And so what I ended up doing was having and setting like a transition period and saying, before, let's just say, before May, all the information in the spreadsheet was going to be unique to that spreadsheet. But then maybe for June, there's going to be some overlapping information where it's in both platforms because we just need that to make that transition. And then in July, all the new information or whatever that timeline is going to be in the new system. And then what you can do then is kind of close out your information in the spreadsheet and keep it there. So if you need to reference, hey, what was our historical information from before? You can go back to that other data source and look it up or run reports. And then for everything new or than that month, you can use the new system. And then, eventually you'll start getting more information in the new system, be able to just rely on that. So it was instead of trying to import everything into the new system, because a lot of work, it won't be exact anyway, or you can do however you use it, right? If you do information based on month, then maybe you import like at a monthly number, like these are our total sales, these are what moved, versus by day or by week where you don't need the granularity.
And Jordan, I think you nailed it. I think you and maybe and when I said bring in your orders, I really meant just kind of connect with Shopify, connect with your e-commerce and start bringing in the current orders, right? So that you can start tracking that data too. Importing all that legacy or that history is a bit overwhelming. So you're spot on, Jordan. And so I would 100% agree.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense to me. Thank you.
Yeah,
of course.
I just one more quick question, and maybe if you covered that, I apologize, because I see on your current slide. So this this software that you have set up, does it automatically connect with QuickBooks?
It does.
And what about WooCommerce? Because we don't use Shopify.
Yeah, we the WooCommerce is coming out next month actually. Yeah, we kind of honed in on Shopify and QuickBooks and ShipStation and nailed those. The thing about integrations is depending on how you do them, they can be really, really good or a little poor. So the WooCommerce and some of the other ones will all be rolling out next month. And so, yeah, that would be, we would just pull it right in and then decrement from inventory as you're fulfilling your orders.
Great. Okay. Sounds like it's perfect timing.
And then Stephanie, if along with that timing, I know you weren't asking this, but if you were interested in Shopify, I'm happy to talk with you offline about that. I made the transition from WooCommerce to Shopify after like 5 years, and saw like a very big kind of dramatic difference in the business because I kind of worked with both. So anyway, if you are interested in that, I'm happy to talk with you offline on how to kind of do it and what the real benefits were, because I had to do it myself.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. And the reason why we honed in on Shopify so much is because of the other channels that Shopify can tap into. Right now, they have Handshake, which is a wholesale place where you can get wholesale orders through a huge database, and also just plug right into the Walmart marketplace, and that pulls right into Shopify. And so those are huge channels that can increase sales significantly.
Perfect. Okay. Stephanie, thank you so much for those questions. If you do have any others, like feel free to jump in a little bit later. Happy to take all your questions here and for everyone else.
Thank you.
Emily just posted a question in the chat as well. Emily, do you want to hop on video to explain? I know you have a kind of lengthy question here that's really talking about kind of waste. Happy to have you answer that live or ask that live.
We have been working with the same copacker since pretty much day one, at least with my time with the company. And so we do with them all of our own purchasing of our inputs, our ingredients and packaging, and managing of our own inventory on that. They do give us periodic inventory updates on that stuff, but it's so far and few between, and we're in production, near constantly, especially since COVID, because they have limits on how much they can produce at a time. So we're having to do smaller, more frequent production runs rather than, like a larger quarterly production model. So at any rate, one of our issues has been when we do get those inventory updates from them, the discrepancies are there. Because there, is to be expected a certain amount of waste, but there doesn't seem to be, even when we've tried to track it, there doesn't seem to really be any consistency in terms of like where we can slap a percentage on it and kind of expect that amount of waste. So I'm just wondering if there's some formula or way to kind of account for this when it doesn't seem to be happening with any kind of pattern. It's just sort of random which items it will be and how much and when, and even sometimes it ends up being overages somehow. So, I'm just wondering kind of if there's a way to sort of manage those inventory discrepancies when your updates from the copacker are coming so far and few between. But we do need to kind of account for that lost product somehow, like in our COGS, and also just, in terms of being able to manage it, because it also at times has led to us getting a call frantically on production day that we don't have enough of something. So figuring out kind of how to track that when there is no pattern to it.
Okay. It is a great question. I see that other people have, want to hear on this too. It is interesting though, because in my experience, usually it is when you get waste in manufacturing, it usually is around the same type of waste on the same ingredient or packaging material, right? If it's film, if it's just, and you can use an overage. So I would try to dig in on why the waste is across different types of items. But to answer your question, how we help with this is we actually do virtual work orders. So basically you're going to build out your bill of material. You're going to understand the amount that you are asking them to produce. And then when they come back to you and they say, hey, we did an overage, we produced 100 extra units, or we did, 50 less, then you can actually push that through in our system and track that waste. But also what it's going to do is you're going to decrement from inventory what it should have been, like if it was an ideal production run, and then you can go in and adjust the inventory based on what they have left over. But what that is going to do is you can also set reorder notifications for each inventory item. And so when you hit those reorder points, it's going to let you know, the system's going to tell you, hey, you need to place an order for this ingredient and get it over to your co-packer for the next run. Right. And so this is something that we are trying to nail for our CPG brands, because that inventory sitting over there is money sitting on their shelves, right? And so you need to be able to track that a little closer than just getting a report from them after production, right? And so I think it makes sense to virtually kind of track the full run and get your true real-time inventory numbers, and then be able to plan the next runs.
It can be difficult to get those updates from them, especially in this post-COVID world. They're understaffed, and also the CPG sector has seen a lot of growth. So all of their clients, not just us, are in a growth phase. So they're overworked, understaffed, and things like asking for inventory updates, especially for, we have our ingredients alone is a long list. So because we have a lot of spices and just like particular things. So, it's hard to get those updates from them. So we're mostly tracking it on our own, but then every 6 months or so, honestly, maybe quarterly if we're lucky, we get updates from them. We are able to get finished goods updates from them a little more
Sure.
frequently. And that
Uh-huh.
actually, we're about to transition to a proper 3PL warehouse. So that should improve a bit, where we'll be getting daily updates and we'll have a better handle on our finished goods. But we're still with this copacker, and the raw materials are still sort of, we do have a percentage, on the packaging. They give us a percentage on what we should expect for losses on our
Okay.
on our packaging, but for the ingredients, it's just sort of random. And even things like a loose nail on a pallet tears open a bag of something, and they lose 5 pounds of something. So it is sort of all over the place, and I just wondered if there's sort of a way to control for that, because it's it does cause production delays from time to time. So
Yeah, I mean, something like that example you just listed, there's no way for you to know that unless they just told you straight away, right?
Yeah.
And hopefully they're not just tying that into the production, but they're letting you know truly how that got wasted. But another thing is to understand your inventory. Is if you send a PO through our system, right, to your supplier for all your spices and ingredients, and then the copacker receives that, you should be receiving it in real time as well in your system to update that inventory, right? If they were sitting on a little bit and then you brought in more, you need to update that and know what your next production run is going to use. And if you do that, kind of proactively, then you can see, all right, if we're producing a little more often, I know I actually have to place another PO with that supplier before the next production run, right?
So we have a tool that does effectively, plug in, this is how much we started with, this is how much we're going to use for this production run, this is how much we need to order, and then also takes into account for how much we should have left over afterwards. What did we order? So we have a calculator that does all of that for us, but that's going strictly off of the numbers in our recipe, which, don't take into account spillage or anything like that. So I guess I'll yield the floor. I just
no, Emily, I hear the frustration in your voice, and I remember that, right? I've been on site for production orders and see ingredients fall to the floor, and my heart drops because I just see money falling to the floor.
Yeah, and some kind of impossible mathematical equation to figure out how much did we just lose in terms of poundage, because again, like I said, we've definitely had those days, production days, where we get that frantic call first thing in the morning, we don't have enough of something. And it's just, that does happen when we're 100% managing it ourselves and never getting an end of production update on where they're actually weighing it out and saying this is how many pounds we have left. So going into it, we're always just really hoping that and we do pad what we order, but to some extent, it's all just sort of guess. Yeah.
Right. And another question would be, is there a way to, get in the same system with them?
Sure.
And that's just, if they're willing to improve their practices, can you kind of get on the same system and share a bit of the visibility into inventory and production? Yeah, I mean, it is definitely a very common pain point, right?
And what I would add, just Emily, as you often knows, right, when starting out, there's less leverage that we have as brands against our co-packers and manufacturers, right? Because they're frantic, and in some cases, they'd rather not have us as clients because we're more work when they're overwhelmed, and so they're almost looking for ways to fire customers a lot of times. And so what it might be is, right, just being able to track it internally, and then as you develop with them and build your volume, or you decide to move to another manufacturer, trying to negotiate those limits at the beginning and say hey, our average waste is 3%, and so we anything above that by poundage to be paid for by cost as part of that agreement. And right, that leverage comes as your company scales and become more of a a value add to the manufacturer based on the right size.
Right.
But at least that way you can track it internally, include it in your costs, and know that what your rates are. Looking at per production orders, you can see how your COGS are changing.
Sure. Yeah. Well, thank you. Appreciate.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Emily.
Put on it. Yeah, that's the ongoing struggle, right?
Other questions? I know Bill's here too. Bill, did you have anything to add to that? I know you've done a ton of work with manufacturing.
Yeah, so I no longer own it, but I founded a company called Prairie City Bakery, and we sold frozen thaw and sell bakery goods. And we had 125 different items, of which we had 11 different copackers. So we outsourced all of our manufacturing. And, one of the things that I think people need to think about, and this is not always easy when you're starting out, but I never wanted to do the copacker's job. In other words, the copacker's job is to manage, they do this all the time with their own product line and ingredients and things like that. And probably 95% of the ingredients were things that were common to what they were already making. And so one of the things that I always tried to do is, and I would say to copackers when I first started out is, listen, I don't want to run your business. I want you to produce it as efficiently as you can. So you need to order the inventory and the products or whatever. The other thing is, then it wasn't my nickel invested in their inventory and their plant that I didn't have any control over. So they made sure they had the right amount of product at the right place at the right time to make the products that we needed. And I wasn't responsible for the inventory that they had. Now that you can't necessarily always do that when you first start out, but if you strive to do that at some point or make that transition, there was times where I had to pay, for instance, one thing that was unique to us was packaging. And, that is something that you're not going to get somebody else to always, it depends on how big the volume is, but it's not something you can always get somebody to agree to pay for up front. But what I would say to them is, okay, I'll pay for the first order, but it's your job to manage the packaging. And I want you to order the packaging because you know when you're out and when you need that product, because they want to do their production planning. And the reality is, if you get big enough, you don't want them waiting for ingredients or packaging coming in for them. So we agreed on a price, and I always agreed to buy back packaging as long as it was no more than 60 to 90 days of what our run rate was if we ended up discontinuing the product. But the rest of the ingredients they used on other products, for the most part, there was sometimes some odd items, but then you let the copacker be a copacker, and you can run your business, and all you're worried about is the inventory coming in and the sales going out versus having to worry about investing all your money and tying it up in the ingredients.
Yeah, absolutely. So most of our products are made at this one copacker, but then we have a secondary copacker that supplies most of the ingredients and most of the packaging for us. But again, we're an Indian sauce company, and we do have a lot of specialty inputs like spices and things like that do need, aren't commonly ordered by the copacker. But to be honest, those tend to be less problematic than the more bulk items that we are ordering. So I definitely hear you. And as we're growing, we're sort of we're having some growing pains with this particular copacker at the moment because they limit how much we can produce at one time. So we're placing multiple production POs with them at a time, and then it's taking weeks for them to get to the end of our production anyway. So, as we're shopping around, if we're considering moving at any time, we're definitely keeping in mind wanting to find a place that can help us with that process more, because it is a lot to manage, and it's really just me. So
thank you so much for that question, Emily. I know there's a lot there, and would love if you have any other further questions, following up with some of our panel or with Morgan, or I can connect with Bill too. He's been in the space for a while too I'm working with Copackers, so happy to make connections to help you on that journey.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Perfect. Any other questions from our audience? I love these questions that are coming in, so thank you for asking. Keep them coming. And with any headaches that you're dealing with, any opportunities that you see into the future, want to understand how to better take advantage of, I think those are all really great questions. And if you do have a question, feel free to just use the raise hand icon or just type, you have a question in the chat.
Yeah, and I will add to what Bill said is what we're seeing is, these startup CPG companies that are getting in very low quantities, they are the manufacturers telling them that they're in charge of sourcing, right? Get all those products here so we can do your run for you. But as you scale and you grow, most co-packers or contract manufacturers are willing to take on that relationship with the suppliers and order that stuff for you when the numbers make sense to them, right? When the runs are big enough. But just because there's so many brands right now and there's so many little co-packers and contract manufacturers, these contract manufacturers I've seen very often do drop the ball when it's lower quantities and these runs are smaller. And so the brand just kind of needs to own that sourcing for a bit to dial it in and make sure they get the products they want. But also even negotiating if the co-packer is willing to house finished goods, right? Like if they're willing to do that and do bigger runs, but you only need to send, 10,000 over to the 3PL for that, and they'll hold another 10 to 20,000 because they just are going to do that run anyways. That's a great thing to negotiate with your co-packers and contract manufacturers.
Morgan, one question that I see come up all the time is, brands theoretically know how to calculate their COGS as a one-time thing. But as you mentioned earlier, like freight costs change from order to order, ingredient costs change from order to order. How does kind of Fiddle, or have you seen software like manage the changing COGS of a product over time?
Yeah, great question. So this is something we actually have been really working on the last 3 or 4 months, and making sure that each different production run, you're able to get your true COGS, right? And so when you send that PO to all your suppliers, even when you send a PO to your co-packer, if you're sourcing all the raws, all you're doing is send a PO for the tolling fee, right? Like you're just sending, like it's going to be $1.50 per unit, and they're going to package and assemble it. So, but then when you go into that actually production and that finished good, we're giving you the space and spots to go ahead and add the freight, the pallet charge, and that's per line item for each inventory, ingredient, packaging, as well as for the runs and the fees, so that when you have that lot of 10,000 units, you can say, all right, that my cost on that was $4.15. And then you do another one, right? You do another run 3 weeks later. My cost on that was $3.85, right? So, and then we're going to track that moving weighted average, right? And so it is a bit more work to really dial that in, but then I've seen the people that do that are the ones that actually scale and are successful. So yeah,
Awesome.
it's a great question though, and it's one of the hardest things for small to even medium-sized brands to dial in.
Yeah, and then I always recommend too, right? I actually suggest taking when you're including your COGS in your internal numbers, using not the average, but actually the high cost of your COGS in there as well. That way you're making sure that on every order that you're sending out, you can try to be profitable or close to that, or what your goals are, because sometimes averages can high fluctuations in there.
As long as your accountant signs off on it,
right? All right, Mark, you have a question as well. Why don't you jump on? You can ask that.
Hey, thank you so much. Morgan, I guess I had a question. You brought up the issue of sort of a smaller firm that might be now sourcing the ingredients with the co-packer, but eventually I think my co-packer is going to want to shift to do the ordering themselves. So, I just kind of curious, there's some, there's some changes that could cause. And I kind of wanted to ask you your thoughts on, the relationship now moves into their hands as opposed to mine. And that's important because if I get samples from the ingredient suppliers, to continue product development, that's one issue I want to maintain the ability to do. And then, but also just liability. This is more of a legal question, liability transfer to the party who's buying the ingredients. I'm just trying to think of all the sort of, all the issues that could arise or not from that transfer.
Yeah, and I guess my answer to that is depending on your co-packer, depending on your contract manufacturer, is the relationship's different. I've seen it done multiple ways. I've seen, a really clean and good partnership between a brand and their co-packer. And it was that move for them sourcing was very clean and was great. And it helps the brand scale because they took that off their plate. Now, it really comes down to your relationship with them. And now if they're sourcing the raws, and they're going to legally be like, they own the raws. Now, if they negotiate that you're going to have to buy them back if you're not producing and running, that's in the contract, right? But again, like Bill said, most co-manufacturers are producing items across multiple brands and are sourcing the same ingredients. So this may come into play for you as a huge benefit because they might get you a better deal because they're bulk buying all this across several brands. But then with that said, if you have unique, let's say potency, unique, like all the difference that go into the ingredients, all the different things that you can track, they may try to buy in bulk from a different supplier than what you want, right? So if you have true suppliers that you want them to go with, you have to include that in the contract and agreements.
One thing I also did was just include the link to a book by Will Madden called Separating the Co-Man from the Con-Man. And that's just a really great resource for anyone who's starting out with manufacturing to understand what considerations you need to keep in mind, kind of how you need to negotiate the contracts, and gives a pretty good comprehensive view as well. So that's a really good book that I recommend. Will's just a great person in the industry as well.
Cool. Thanks, Jordan.
My only complaint about that book is that I don't think it adds enough on like the reps and warranty, like some of the meat of the contract that just my personal view of it's a great book and it's very helpful. But, if you really want to get into the weeds of like, some of the terms of a contract that you might want to give you some, I don't know, creative thinking. I thought the book didn't have as much on that.
Here, that's a good point. Here's one thing that happens, Mark, too, unfortunately. So like we worked with 3 different manufacturers over the course of T-Squares, and at our volume at the time, all of them refused to actually give us a written contract because they did not want to be locked into an agreement with us and basically want the option to dump us whenever they wanted to. And so it's interesting because I've actually found that across the board that most, at least like the medium to larger size manufacturers, actually won't set up a contract unless you're doing a minimum volume in there. So it's interesting because some of them will get creative with you. And it's mostly when they actually want your business because you're going to be driving sales for them. It's crazy that for most manufacturers, they actually aren't profitable on the first run, let alone the first year of working with most companies. It's really only after years like 2 or 3. And so a lot of them are kind of very skeptical of working with brands, which is interesting.
I think you're totally right. And I think that's what the most important lesson of that book is, to work with the right kind of co-man. If you're a small company and you can find one who's better for your needs, that was one of my big takeaways, personal experience. So yeah, totally agree.
Yeah. But Mark too, I'm happy to, have you talked to Will?
No, I've not.
Okay. I mean, if you're interested, I'm happy to connect you with him or some others who work with co-manufacturers directly to get some of those ideas of like, what are some of the points that you can negotiate and the terms or things to do or not to do. And then even like what's pushing the lines and what they're willing to do. So happy to connect with you offline about that.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
Perfect. So we have about 8 minutes left. Any last burning questions that you have? All right, we just got a comment in the chat here. Yep, treating the co-man as a partner. Thanks so much for adding that in. I think that's a great comment there. One thing that also came up is, I know Morgan, you're probably less so versed to talk about this topic, but there's do you form an equity agreement with your co-manufacture in terms of manufacturing your product. There's a couple companies I know, Boo Brands, which does bouillon cubes. They ended up forming an actual equity partnership with their manufacturer, along with Ithaca Hummus did so as well. A company called Grassroots. So if that is a route that you're considering, let me know. I'm happy to connect you with the founders there, because I think that's another option. I guess, Morgan, one other question for you then is, what do you kind of see as that ideal tech stack for CPG brands during their operations? Like, how much can they do in a software like Fiddle versus connecting it to other tools? Kind of, I know you have some examples on here, Shopify, QuickBooks, ShipStation, but what other things do you see as that ideal tech stack?
Yeah, I mean, the one that we see here on the graphic is the one we see the most often, right? The Shopify, pushing into QuickBooks for your accounting. Now, most CPGs that aren't fulfilling themselves are just relying on their fulfillment 3PL to either log into a ShipStation or use their own software, and get good rates. On top of that, what we kind of see is a CRM, right? Pipedrive or HubSpot type CRM that they're tracking everything in. More and more common is, different EDI as you're growing, and you want that integration and that kind of flow. And so, SBS Commerce is one that we hear quite often. And I think that's really the tech stack that we see the most, right? Marketplaces are becoming more and more common. Amazon is obviously the biggest and a great place to sell if you don't necessarily want to own your customers, right? We just want to get that brand awareness and get those sales. But there are tons and tons of little niche marketplaces that are popping up that you can increase sales significantly. And so our hope is by end of year that we have little integrations built with all of those too, like a Fair, right? And then getting on Handshake on Shopify and using Walmart Marketplace. But yeah, this is the tech stack that I see the most. And our focus is to make it, like Emily talked about, is just tracking all those details, right? And being able to get your true COGS. That's our focus. I know we only have a few minutes left. And so I wanted to say we do have an offer for everybody here. That's a nice discount that I can show you, as well as we have a list of co-packers and suppliers. That's a free database that anybody can tap into, and I'll put that in the chat. But yeah, I mean, I think this has been such a great topic and such a great, diving into the pain points of working with co-mans and co-packers, that I just really appreciate, Jordan, you hosting this.
Yeah, I love that. And I think there are a couple of people interested. So do you want to talk about the promo deal and the plans available for those who are interested?
Yeah, so we're going to help, like I said, we're going to help you track all your orders, your recipes, formulas, bill of materials, and all the suppliers, vendors that you're going to bring into the system with their pricing, their leads, and their MOQs. So as you're doing production runs, you can virtually do a run in Fiddle and then deplete all your raws and add your finished goods into inventory. So you're not relying on spreadsheets to do all this automation. And you're not just relying on your 3PL and your co-packer to give you updates on inventory, but we're going to help you proactively get additional POs sent out to make sure that you're ready to do the next production run, right? And then give you that reporting and help you track true COGS so that you have systems in place to go land a big box store, a Costco, a big chain. Those compliance documents, we create those too in Fiddle. So the typical, tier is essential for what we've talked about. And that's $299 a month with 3 users. And we're going to take 100 off of that. And then the onboarding is usually about $1,000, $999. We're going to take 500 off of that and offer, almost $1,100 discount to everybody here and everybody part of Food Bevy. As kind of just like, we love this group and we love what you're doing, Jordan.
Appreciate it. Thanks so much. So what I'll do as well is send out an email with this information on how you can get signed up and connected with Fiddle, but definitely think it's an awesome platform that, I wish I had in the earlier days and would switch over to with T-Squares. So definitely take advantage of this. Thank you so much for everyone joining today. Really appreciate all your questions. I'll be sending out a email recording of this conversation as well, so you can catch up on anything that you missed. And with that, have a great rest of your week and good luck, and hope you bring in some business this week. Have a good one.
All right. Thanks, Jordan.
Bye.